Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am recording this lecture for a second time because I noticed that I had a bunch of typos on my slides last time. So hopefully that's fixed now and we can get going. All right, sharing my screen, recording, have the transcript going. Here we go. So, welcome back to Literature 2121, Animals in Literature. We are talking about anthropomorphic literature. I hope you read Redwall this week, classic of children's literature, that one. That's, of course, a joke. Welcome back to Philosophy 2600, Ethics and Science. And what we're going to do today is we are going to talk about animals, which is a fascinating subject, and I'm excited to get into it with you. So before we jump in, our piece this week was by Peter Singer, and he raises some really good points, but I want to talk about some background before we get into Singer's ideas. First, a little history. So, looking at the history of animals in science and philosophy, something you should know is that science and philosophy were not considered separate subjects until fairly recently in human history, and it's probably good we've separated them, but again, for a while, science was philosophy, philosophy was science. So for Aristotle, he would say animals have a soul, just not a rational one. That animals could have desire, they had mobility, which separated them from plants, but they didn't have this higher capacity for rationality that humans do. Rene Descartes had similar ideas, except he would say animals were unfeeling machines. They respond to stimuli, and that's it. His example, and a reason why I don't like Descartes very much, is that he kicked a dog in front of his friend and said, "Look, it responds to stimuli." I don't like him very much. Then we had Spinoza, who would say that animals feel, but we can do with them as we please. And, throughout the history of science, the practice of vivisection, which was the dissecting of an animal, sometimes alive, so that we could understand their inner workings better, was fairly common. I have two articles here from the National Institute of Health here, if you want to read them, going into more gruesome detail, but I don't want to spend my time there because it's gross. And then a third piece, which is fairly interesting, is written by a guy named Jerry Root. I know Dr. Root somewhat personally. I attended the institution he teaches at rather, and we had interacted once or twice. He's a scholar on C.S. Lewis. Lewis is a religious figure, but he had a lot of concern for animals, right? He's the guy who wrote Narnia, and he actually was somewhat of an animal rights advocate for his day. Jerry Root's piece, which was published by the Humane Society, kind of details that if you're curious about it. I'll link all these on our Canvas page. You might also be surprised to know that even in recent history, things that you wouldn't think had ethical implications for animals actually dealt a lot with animals. A example here, and I can link a book that goes into some detail about it. If you're curious, email me. I'll also put it in the Canvas page, is the development of the pregnancy test. The first pregnancy tests required that urine from the woman who wanted to know if she was pregnant was injected into the body of a rabbit. The rabbit died in this process, but somehow with what changed inside the rabbit, they could tell that the woman was pregnant. And, we would say today, well, killing a rabbit seems kind of unethical for that purpose. And somebody else thought that too. And so they figured out you could do the same thing with a frog and it didn't kill the frog. You could use a pregnancy test frog for 15 years before it finally died. Singer, when we get into him, would say, hold on, you're still causing suffering to the animal, it's just not dead. Then we have the history of sort of what separates human and animal. And a lot of different answers have been given here. You might recognize a few, you might even agree with a few, and that's okay. Greek philosophy would say we have a different essential nature. Looking back at Aristotle, animals have a different kind of soul than humans do. Then in religious traditions, at least in the West, you would say, well, humans are made in the image of God and animals aren't. That's the Imago Dei. I would say, and Singer hints at it a little bit, that there is scholarship that would question that, and that it is a very fascinating place of scholarship, but it is not the subject of our class. If you're curious about it, email me and I will link you some resources. Western philosophy would say that humans have a higher capacity for reason that animals do not. Thinking of Descartes, right? He loved math. And I am capable of advanced mathematics in theory. I'm not great at math, and my dog is not. And that's just how it is. Maybe they will eventually join us in rationality, and then we have to account for that. That's been a source of some interesting science fiction, actually. There's a series of books called the Uplift Saga, I think, that deals in that. Or in medieval theology, there was this idea of the great chain of being that came from a mixture of sources, including Aristotle, but also alchemy, where they would say, look, there's this hierarchy of being in the universe. Humans are on it, but they're not at the top. There's heavenly beings above it, and animals are somewhere below us, and that's just the way nature is. Most of us would kind of question the chain of being these days, but that was the answer that was given. Then there's this question of, well, maybe we have some intrinsic worth and dignity that animals do not. I matter more than an animal. I can't tell you exactly why, but I have inherent worth, right? And then what about the idea of special characteristics? Maybe there is something special about the human, and we haven't named it yet, but it could be there, and it separates us. It makes us greater than animals, and I need to live, and I'm going to eat that chicken. Then what does Singer say? Well, he says, look, there's no rational basis for this separation the way he sees it. This rational nature argument only works to a point. It's been used in history to strip other humans of their moral status. If you've looked at the history of prejudice, anybody who is considered lesser, the argument has been that they don't have the rational nature that, white men do. And of course, the people making that argument are wrong. We don't need to make the same arguments as racists and sexists and slavers. We should reject those arguments. Singer has a good point there. This rational nature argument is not one we need to continue with. So what replaces it? And then also, not all humans are rational. And do we want to say that they have no moral status? Do babies have no moral status because they haven't developed rationality yet? Many of us would say no. And I think you'd be right to say no. What about, people in vegetative states who are never going to wake up again? Have they lost their moral status because they are no longer rational? Again, that seems like an argument you don't want to make. That's going to lead you to some pretty dark places. What about this argument of intrinsic worth and dignity? Singer would say, look, that's just the image of God argument, but outside of the context of religion. And he's got a point there. Again, lots of really good scholarship in the world of religion, kind of going into that, having that conversation. Singer is not himself religious. And I would actually say it's a good thing that he punts on this question, that he doesn't engage with it. Second. A lot of the time, people who are not themselves religious, dealing in religious scholarship, fundamentally misunderstand something. And he kind of says, look, that's not a conversation I'm going to have. He does deal with religion in some of his other works, but not here, and I appreciate it. I might also add this idea that, rationality is key to what it means to be human. That is itself an assumption from Rene Descartes. Are we always rational beings? I'm not sure that's what makes us a living, breathing person. Wouldn't it be easier to say that we're relational beings? Does mathematics, does our capacity for mathematics make us human? Probably not. But what about our relationships with other people, with animals, with the world around us? Wouldn't it be more accurate to say that we are loving things than thinking things? I would guess yes. You might disagree, and that's okay. But again, Singer has a really good point that this whole rational nature argument, dealing everything in rationality and dignity, it does not make sense when you want to break it down. And I would emphasize that, yeah, if you want to focus on the rational nature thing here, you are going down a path I can't follow because there's a whole lot of awful stuff there. His big point is to say, instead of worrying about all that where the answers are not clear, what about can they suffer? The capacity for suffering rather than the capacity to do math is a good basis for moral status in Singer's view. And it makes pretty good experiential sense, right? Like we might want to dispute this a little bit in a couple slides, but just thinking about it, pleasure is good. I like when I am pleased. I like when I am happy. Suffering, which is pain, is wrong. I feel wronged when I'm suffering. And so, therefore, the lessening of suffering is itself a moral good. Yeah, makes a lot of sense, right? He emphasizes empathy. Try to see the world from the perspective of the other. Others in quotes there because if something is being treated as other, it is probably not being treated as having exactly the same moral status as you. Eliminating the boundaries there was part of Singer's project. And he would admit that our capacity for empathy with things that are different from ourselves is limited, but not impossible. Can I ever really gain the perspective of a chicken? Well, no. But is it ridiculous to say that I might not like if I'm being slaughtered for food in the manner that a chicken is? Well, yes, that makes plenty of sense. But Singer does foresee a problem. What happens when human suffering and animal suffering are opposed to each other? A good example here is eggs. Eggs are a cheap source of food, especially if you don't have a lot of money. You can buy a carton of eggs for a little over $1 and it'll feed you for, I don't know, 3-4 days. But those chickens that produce those eggs are probably not being treated well. And so, how do we weigh suffering against suffering here? If we treat hens in such a better way, does that make the eggs more expensive and makes it so that the poor can't eat? You know, just eliminating the problem of animal suffering does not eliminate human suffering. So what do? Well, weigh things as carefully as possible with as much research as possible. He's making a very utilitarian argument here.
That might be on the quiz.
Yeah. If you didn't hear the whisper, that might be on the quiz. And, we might not know the boundaries of suffering, but we can do more research. We can find out, we can reevaluate our previous actions, and we can move on to a more just world with less suffering in it for both humans and animals. Makes plenty of sense to me, right? However, we might want to ask some questions. So, questions to ask when weighing, questions to weigh when acknowledging animals as moral equals. First, animal testing. Where exactly do we place the line? Is it in the exact same place we would for humans? Well, that's tough, right? Because a human can understand that they are suffering and they might be suffering for a good cause, but an animal can't. And what about psychological damage? The line's a little unclear for animals there, right? Yeah. What harms an individual person's psyche? Well, they can probably tell you. But is the rat that I'm making run mazes for cheese? It's a lot more difficult to tell if the rat has anxiety and I'm causing it mental strain by putting it in the maze, right? Better yet, how do I obtain consent from a rat? Say I'm doing medical research and I'm trying to see if I can stop rats from developing tumors. I can't get the rat to sign a waiver. And then questions concerning, the ethics of food and climate change. And this piece is a little older, so it doesn't deal much in climate change, but there's a reality that's hard to grapple with here, which is that store-bought vegetables have a much larger carbon footprint than, for example, a hunted deer. If you live in the woods and you shoot a deer and you eat that thing all winter, your carbon footprint is like this big. But you've caused that animal suffering. Whereas somebody who is, say, a vegetarian or a vegan who buys their vegetables at the store because you can't grow food everywhere, their carbon footprint is a lot bigger because those vegetables are being shipped across the country, sometimes across the world, in machines that pollute the air and potentially cause much more suffering in the future, or even cause human suffering depending on the status of the people picking your vegetables. So it's something to weigh. It's not an easy thing to figure out mathematically. We might also want to ask, well, where do we place animals in our communities or our families? My family has a couple of dogs in it, and those dogs have a pretty high moral status with us. But the mice that live in my house do not. I set out traps to kill the mice that have come into my house because they are a nuisance and I don't want them pooping on the floor and they're dirty. I'm not affording them the same moral status that I am my dogs. So why? How is that? And there's not clear answers there. And then another question is, well, just how far does my personal morality go? Say I completely sever my relationship with any kind of product that harms an animal in any way. Those animals are still being harmed. I haven't actually stopped them from being harmed. I've just ended my monetary, participation in it. But the suffering is still happening. So, is this a question of societal morality and personal morality? How far do we need to push ethics on others? I don't have an answer for that, but I hope that we discuss it in our discussion boards this week. Moving on, let's zoom in on a problem a little bit. This is a real world problem experienced by a friend of mine. So, carbon footprints and consumption. Somebody that I went to school with when I was getting my master's, after we finished, they got themselves a job in Noatak, Alaska. Noatak is right up here this is, I think, the county. It's up there. It's, you are at the roof of the world. And in that community, he quickly found out that most people, they forage and they hunt for food. And why? Well, packaged foods come by plane and they are really expensive. If you wanted to buy a box of mac and cheese, you were going to do that for like a birthday dinner or something because it was going to be a lot of money. Food came by plane, and part of that also means it has a much higher climate impact. And my friend was concerned about the climate, but also a vegetarian. And so he kind of had to weigh these things. He had three things he's weighing: is the cost of, if he was going to be a vegetarian, he needed to get like beans delivered, but also he didn't want to hurt any animals, but also it hurts the climate. And so he needed to make a moral choice about, can he still be a healthy vegetarian and care for the planet and live in this community? And the choice he ultimately made was that he was causing less suffering by participating in the hunting of this community, which then ingratiated him into the community. So that helped the human relationships there. And he was going to cause less suffering participating in the eating of animals every once in a while than if he had just been a staunch vegetarian and eaten this food that was delivered by plane. Yeah, it's a real world ethical dilemma. And was he right in that situation? I'm not sure. I'm not the one to make that call. Certainly he had his reasonings, and I think his reasoning was pretty good. Then zoning in on a different problem. What about necessary suffering? Here on the right is a picture of my dog, Gracie. This last week, Gracie went in for her first round of heartworm treatment. It was painful. They had to give her a shot. The vet told me it went directly into her spinal column, and she has clearly been in a little bit of pain since then. I have to put her on painkillers and a steroid for the next couple weeks, and then we have to do this whole thing again another 2 times. The pain that she's going through for this, it has a good end, which is the removal of heartworm from her body and the extension of her life. But she can't rationally understand that. What she knows is that it hurt, and she's not a huge fan of the people who hurt her, which were the people at the vet's office, which are the ones who are helping her. So, what does this mean? To help her flourish, some suffering is necessary so that she can have a life of greater flourishing in the future. She is doing okay, by the way, if you're worried about everything I just said. She's right over there sleeping soundly because the meds are doing their job. She can't exercise from like now until June, which is going to be the hardest thing, but we're making it work. She's a happy girl. And then another question we might want to ask, and something that maybe Singer doesn't go into as much detail as he should, is suffering always morally wrong? Thomas Merton, who we read a little while ago, he wrote in his autobiography, the one who does the most to avoid suffering in the end is the one who suffers the most. If you spend your whole life avoiding suffering for yourself, well, then every little thing you encounter is going to cause you suffering. The avoidance of pain brings more pain. Just that seems to be experientially true. And then what about in Buddhism? The suffering is one of the Four Noble Truths, and you free yourself from suffering by freeing yourself from attachment. And how does that work with Singer's approach to suffering? And I don't know that it does, because again, it's the avoidance of suffering instead of freeing from suffering. And then what about, what matters most here? Is it the avoidance of suffering or the response to suffering that matters most? Because yes, you might want to avoid suffering in others. You don't want to cause others to suffer. But I'd care more about the empathetic response we have to those who are suffering. How do we help those who are already hurting? You know, this piece is titled Animal Liberation. Well, what about liberating animals who are presently suffering? Instead of just talking about, in the future, what do we do about, animals who may suffer? There's real suffering happening now. And then another point we might raise is that at least some degree of suffering in humans leads to greater happiness and empathy, right? Like, have you ever met anyone who's never suffered? They're hard to be around because they don't understand that other people might have hurt. And so that's something to weigh as well. Again, does it discount Singer's argument? Absolutely not. I think he raises a very good point, because we do not want to cause unnecessary suffering in others. That's the utilitarian argument, right? But this idea that suffering is always wrong, we might want to say, okay, let's pause here and add some nuance. And so that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to tear down his argument anyway. Just to, let's pause, say maybe suffering isn't always wrong. When it happens in our own lives, we can grow from it. It can make us greater. Not that we should seek it out, but to say that it is the worst possible thing in the universe might be an overstatement. And does he go that far? Well, I'm not sure, but I thought we'd devote a slide to it. So what do we do next? Well, for next week, I want you to read chapter 3 in our main textbook, which is the Ethics and Science one. I want you to read a piece by a guy named Merton, who is not our favorite monk, Thomas Merton, but is a scientist. And that piece is called The Normative Structures of Science. That is in the Canvas page for next week. I want you to watch lectures 6 and 7. Those are coming down the pipeline. I'm going to get those recorded in the next couple days here. And then you have a quiz for Module 2, because this is officially the end of Module 2. And that is due on February 12th. I will get it uploaded earlier than it says in the syllabus, just because it's easier for me to do it that way. But it is still due on the 12th. Again, that's going to be 10 multiple choice questions taken directly from our readings. And you are totally welcome to look at those while you are taking the quiz. I encourage it, actually. Other than that, what's left? We have a discussion post this week, and I want you to pick one of these 3 questions, and I will post it there so you don't have to worry about pausing the video here while you write. But pick one of the following questions, answer it in 250 plus words. The normal rubric always applies. It will be posted on the discussion post. Don't worry about that. So what are the questions? First, what rights should be afforded to animals in our society and in scientific study? What moral duties do we have to animals? I want you to explain your reasoning and tell me which theory of ethics you're operating in. Question 2, should cloning be banned or encouraged? How and why? Which theory of ethics does your answer operate in? And then third question, can the source of ethics be known, and what is it? Is it culture? Is it nature? Is it divinity, reason, something else entirely? Explain your answer. Obviously, all 3 of these questions here come from one of the readings this week. I just want you to pick one, write about it, always respond to a peer. You guys have been writing some really great stuff lately. I am learning some things from you, which is very encouraging. So yeah, hope you all have a good day. Hope that this was a worthwhile discussion and the background was helpful for you. I am going to go work on some other stuff, but thank you for joining me, and I will see you again soon.